Okay, the next speaker is Uta Allers. She is a native German and English speaker who has expertise and has provided services in translating and transcribing documents from World War I and II, German and Jewish veterans, survivors, and family histories that are written in regular and Old German script. Her works include translating interviews for the US Holocaust Museum, translating books by Holocaust survivors, and archival documents dating from the 1700s. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Miss Uta Allers.
Thank you, Mary. Hi, I'm sorry I can't see anyone, but I'll do my best to be, connective. So my name is either Uta in English or Uta in German. Either way is fine. When we came over, my father said, there's no U in the English language, so you're a U. So whatever language I'm speaking in is the way I pronounce it. Well, I thought I might just tell you a little bit about myself, how I came to this work, and then a little bit of German history and the script that is used and what makes it particularly difficult in some cases with genealogy, depending on how far it goes back, to come up with, the exact wording of a document, whether it's a birth certificate, baptismal, death, whatever. So I was born into Nazi Germany in 1943, into the bombings of Hamburg. And we left. My father got a visa to Canada on the West Coast. That's where I grew up on Vancouver Island. And then I eventually, through marriage, came to the United States. And that has been my home now for a long time. I did go back to Germany after the wall came down. I realized I didn't know anything about the modern Germany. It was all bombed out when we left. And I was going to stay a year and I stayed for 10. And it was quite an experience. I taught English to East Germans who had to catch up now that, they were unified and they had only Russian in school, except maybe after school they could take some English, but their English teacher could not travel. So it was mostly book English. Anyway, so I did that, made some very good friends, got into the bicycling club, and I went to Berlin, which had 10,000 members just in Berlin, and went on the tours, which were wonderful. So but having gone back to Germany is what gave me the language. I read the newspaper every day, the Berliner, the equivalent of the New York Times. I had to look up a lot. I took lessons to get caught up for the 44 years that I had missed. And eventually came back to Rochester, New York, and then came down to DC. And I did some, about 4 years of volunteer translation work for the US Holocaust Museum. I don't know if you've ever heard of the movie Shoah, the 9.5-hour movie exploring what had happened in some of the camps. And so anyway, it was a huge project, took about 4 years on and off. And then I also worked part-time at the Goethe Institute, which is the German Cultural Center in Washington, DC. And somebody wanted help with some postcards from World War I that were written in the old script. I did not learn that script in school. By the time I went to school in 49, we were doing cursive. And I said to my coworkers, I said, well, I don't know it. And they said, oh, come on, there's got to be a way to learn it. You don't have to write it. You just have to learn to read it. So by that time, I had decided DC was too expensive for me to live. I came to Baltimore, and I was at a Zion Church sale of German, I don't know what you'd call it. It was just a little thing where you could buy German goods and stuff. And I happened to run into an elder woman who who organized it. And I said, at your age, madam, you probably have learned the old script. Oh, yes, she said, I grew up with it in Silesia, which is now Poland, Breslau. And I said, I would pay you to teach me because I need it for the work that I'm doing for the Goethe Institute. And she said, no, I can't do it. I look at a whole word and then I know what it is. I cannot take it apart. But if you come over to me, we'll look something up. We'll do it. Sure enough, I went to her and she said, we're going to go on, we're going to Google this. So we Googled something called Zutterlin, S-U umlaut, we'll leave out the umlaut, T-T-E-R-L-I-N, which is the standardized old script, what they used to call Gothic. Before that, anyway, to finish that sentence, I saw online what the alphabet would look like. And then it was just a matter of applying it to people's handwriting, whether it was postcards or genealogical records or letters, which in itself was a challenge, as you can imagine. So what was I going to just, my train of thought here. Okay, let me just give you a little bit of history with this language. Before Germany became a unified nation, it was very late in becoming a unified nation in 1871. Before that, France, Spain, Great Britain, the Netherlands, they were all one unit, and they, plied the seas and got colonies and so on. Germany was 300 plus principalities, princedoms, kingdoms, fiefdoms, and was constantly at war. It had no natural borders, really. Got wiped out in the 30 Years' War in the 1600s. And it wasn't until the German Franco-Prussian War in 1871, which Germany won, and that they became, through the Prussians were the strongest kingdom, became an empire. And after that, it was decided that this Gothic way of writing needed to be unified because of those fiefdoms and princedoms. They all had their own way of writing. And Mary, I don't know if you can, from my PowerPoint, bring up this page. Can find it.
The one with the writing starting with C-H-R-I-L-T?
No, it's the one with all the different letters like this.
Okay. There
Yeah?
we go. Got it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I can't see it, but I have it in front of me. So if you will look on the extreme left, you will see a Gothic A, the printed version, right? And then after that, you have 3 lines of what a written Gothic A could look like. There are 5 pages of this for all the letters of the alphabet. Then to the right, you have the small a. So you can see how difficult it would be from the 1700s, say, and the 1800s to decipher the words. And if you don't have a letter where there's, context embedded in it, just maybe columns of dates and place names and family names, first names, that is what makes it really difficult. What happened then, once Germany became unified, they decided to standardize what they called the Gothic script.
Yes, sir.
And then
everybody's starting to say they can't see the PowerPoint. They're tired of looking at this screen.
Can't see the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Do you see what's on the screen?
Yes, and you are screen sharing.
Yeah, but you have a list of all your files on your computer. You're not sharing her presentation.
Okay.
Okay, let's give her a chance to find it.
Now?
There it is.
I
Okay.
see it. I see it. Okay, great. So let's look at this again. To the extreme left, that is a Gothic A, the printed version, which is not that hard to read. But, and then the first A is what they standardized it to later. But before that, all those next 3 lines are variations of the letter A. And then to the right, the small letter A. So you can see when one is confronted with an old document, this can be tough. I must say I haven't seen some of the second and third lines at all, but there's 5 pages of this, you know, with every letter of the alphabet. Okay, so that's the old Gothic, what they called it. I've written Zutterlin on there at the top so you can see how the name is spelled. And that is the first letter after the printed one. So then the German government decided to standardize it since they were now a united empire. And they got a man named Zutterlin, Jacob or somebody, to come up with a standard way of writing. And thank you, Mary. This is it. You can see that there's no variation now. It's A, B, C, right? And that's what everyone learned in school. My parents did, my grandparents, I did not. Now, I want to say about the cover of this little booklet. It is invaluable. It is put out by the Indiana German Heritage Society. If you were to go on their website, you could find this little $5, it used to be $5. This is what Germans coming over from the States used as of 1881. They learned how to do this writing. It's called Deutsch English, German English, Schreib- und Lesefibel, primer, a writing and reading primer, the new first reading book. It is all translated into English. It's a new version of it. And then it gives you lots of samples, practice way to write this, or not, you don't have to write it. You just have to read it, right? You know, from dog to cat to eagle to owl. So I highly recommend for Mary, for instance, to have it in your library. And I didn't photocopy the bottom of it, which says Indiana German Heritage Society, Inc. And just go on their website. Okay, so we got that far with how the language evolved, or how the spelling of it evolved. Then what happened, and it tells you that right in this primer, this very one that's up now, that the Nazis in their anti-Semitic hysteria said Gothic was not German. That was made up by the Jews. That's a Jewish product. So we're going to get rid of this Zutterlin and this Gothic stuff, and we're going to go cursive. That's what I then and others of my generation and from then on learned. So, but going back before that, of course, we have the old. So I'm just going to show you a sample of what I struggled with the other day. Thank you, Mary. That's perfect. So number 2, you can see Christian Friedrich Grimm died on 18th of July at the age of 75 years, blah, blah, blah. What this client wanted to know is, where in the heck does my family come from? It's her great-great-grandfather, I think it was 3 Gs or whatever, And so it was up to me to figure that out amongst the names of who his wife was and the children, how many children, blah, blah. So on the third line, you will see Buchwald. Can you read that? Buchwald. In Vogtland, that is the area, that maybe the county equivalent. In Königreich, kingdom. And then the next word, I couldn't get it. I couldn't get it. Looked like an S, F. So I had to turn to my 92-year-old Brigitte, who got me into this initially, send it to her. I said, Brigitte, if you're up for it, she'd had COVID despite her, shots and blah, blah. She loves history. She took one look and she said, oh, that's Saxony. I was saved. Then I could write to my client, that's what it is. Your family comes from Saxony, which was the former East Germany, abutting the Czech Republic, Bavaria, Thuringia, and she was thrilled. Now she knew. But that's the kind of challenge that I have, and that I'm glad to do. And I still have the help, luckily, of my dear Brigitte, whom I'm going to visit later today at the Pickersgill retirement home. So let's see, that's basically what I have to share. And I would be glad to take questions. I see in the chat there are several. Let me see if I can access the chat. I do not see the shared screen. Okay, got it. Okay, let me see if there's some other ones here. The screen is not being shown. Okay. I don't see anything. Let me see if I can move it down a bit here. Still seeing Explorer, cannot see picture. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, it's mostly that you couldn't see. Okay. Take some sort of substantive questions.
Yeah, that looks like it's it. Thank you very much.
And I did put up my my business card, Mary, in
Yes.
case anyone would like to contact me. Just send me an email or give me a call. I can't guarantee that I will get every single word, but enough to help you along with your search for your ancestry.
There we go. Got it. And
Yeah, great.
and if you Google Uta Allers, she comes right up. And
Right. And then I do have a website, which just shows the books that I've done and the families I've worked with, especially here in Baltimore. So, yeah.
What kind of documents did you do for the Holocaust Museum?
The main thing I worked on was the movie Shoah, which was 300 hours of interviews. And the director, Claude Lanzmann from France, who also spoke German, interviewed 300, and then he used 9.5 of those hours to make a long film. It used to be shown, well, 30 years ago, was shown in theaters here. And then he donated this other valuable historical information, all these films, these interviews. He donated them to the Holocaust Museum, and they wanted them, before he cut it all up, he transcribed it. So it was all printed out, and they asked if I would do the German translation. So they would give me, 150 pages of an interview, and then I would work away at it. The first one was a real shocker. I got home and I started to, it wasn't difficult, it wasn't academic, it was interviews, people are talking. And then I got, he was at Auschwitz and he was pulling the corpses out of the ovens. So I won't go into any more detail, but it took some doing. It took
Oh,
some doing.
wow.
So
Wow.
it went for about 4 years.
Wow. And I don't know if a lot of people are aware, but there are only certain records that are maintained at the Holocaust Museum. So if you're doing family search and or some other search and you look online, you may not find the same records as you can find at the Holocaust Museum. They have they have like a separate
The
archive there.
Yeah.
And I found family information there for a friend who was looking for information and that I couldn't find anywhere else.
Ah,
They have
yes.
computers right in the middle that you can sit down and do research.
yes. And they're always eager, if it's Jewish historical documents, letters, whatever, to have them, you know, to put those in their archives.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're very eager
That's-
to have those. Yes, yes,
That's good to know.
yes.
Okay, and so if there's no more questions, Uta, thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah, it was great. And
And
there's
I'm
Chris.
going to
Hi.
stop share. There we go.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm in and then go.
Okay,
Thanks for having me.
thank you.
Mary,
Yes.
I had two separate questions.
Oh, wait a minute.
The first question deals with, for example, like the Baltimore German newspapers and the typesetting that they used for the Deutsches Correspondent, which ran during the latter part of the 19th century into the early 20th century in Baltimore. What is a tool that we could use to help understand the type script that they were using in that newspaper to be able to figure things out? For example, obituaries and other marriage
Right.
announcements and those type of things.
Was it just the Gothic print? Did it look something like that?
At the top, yes.
The Gothic print.
Yeah,
Are you have trouble reading that?
yes. We have ways to,
think-
it is on a website called Chronicle of America through the Library of Congress. And if you use that tool, you're able to transcribe, hit a translation button. And 9 times out of 10, you do get some of the information, but at times it is kind of hairy of what it actually does. Is there any online references that you would recommend, especially with the typesetters that printers would use, German printers would use when they were publishing these papers that we could utilize today when trying to read these old German newspapers?
So you're not talking about translation, talking reading the script.
Reading the script itself
Gothic
in the
print,
newspaper.
the print.
Correct.
Yeah. If you were to put Google Gothic print, it
Okay.
would give you the alphabet, so that at least you would know, you know, you could write it out then. Gothic print, it should come right up just like Zutterlin does.
Does that work in Google Translate?
And sometimes it does bring it up. Yes, it does work in Google Translate, only if you bring up the German newspaper from Baltimore in Chronicle of America. They have a text feature, which allows it automatic switch over to English. So a lot of it gets, sometimes it doesn't, but it really depends. And then you have to search for what you were actually doing. So that was that question. The other
Yeah.
question is probably more of a iffy thing. When Americans went and invaded Berlin at the end of World War II, they confiscated a copy of the SS files, which we now have at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And I do heirs research for law firms and things. And several years ago, there was an instance where those records would have played a part in a missing heirs case. And from some researchers' standpoint, there appears to be some genealogical records within those items, for example, baptism records, death records, those sort of things. But then people also were also getting a point of, is some of it fabricated? And my question to you is, what is your opinion of those files that we have sitting at the National Archives in DC?
You're talking above my head. I know nothing about it.
Okay.
Yeah, because it doesn't have to do with the translation or anything that I've read about, German history. And while I was in Berlin, I did a lot, but I hadn't come across those files that you just talked about.
Yeah, they're all apparently written in German, all original records and things, and it's just one of these things where it's like people have written about them and different
But they've
ones
been
have different
translated,
opinions
right?
about it. I'm sorry?
They've been translated. I'm sure they've been translated by now, right?
I'm not sure. I just, yeah, it's thousands and thousands and thousands of documents. Germany has a 100-year statute on them where we have them available to the public.
Yeah, good. Yeah, sorry, Chris, I can't help you with that one.
That's fine.
Thank you, Uta.
Okay.
Our next speaker is Chris Smithson, who in this area is an infamous genealogical researcher and genealogist. He started, looking for my introduction, he started doing genealogy research at the age of 8, has continued for over 30 years. He is active in several lineage societies, and as well as several local historical and genealogical societies. And I am going to make you host now. And just don't hang up on.
I press up. Give me 1 second to figure out where this.
Okay, and
went
everybody should stay on after Chris's talk. We're going to have drawings for the door prizes.
All right, give me 1 second. Figure out why this thing is acting up. There we go. Okay, I'm just going to run it this way. Mary, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. For some reason, when you have two monitors, it wants to decide to play tricks on you. So what I'm going to talk about is a few little things over the last 30 years of research that I've come across at different cases where ancestors have lied. What type of things would they lie about? Their identity, their marriage, having another family, or even family stories that basically have been, in some cases, carried on from generation to generation, that they have fabricated to a point where what actually was the truth wasn't what was being carried down. The first case I have here is of a guy named Henry Clay Hill. And Henry Clay Hill was a gentleman from Virginia who decided to desert his family, join the Civil War in Indiana. And what later happened in 1902 was he applied for an invalid pension for an injury that he received during the war. And through the information, Henry Clay Hill proceeded to say that he had no family. He had no children, no wife, no nothing. The pension itself is actually at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And among that pension were several, not only his account of his service and that sort of thing, also he talked about how he filled out a questionnaire explaining where he said he was from, which was also fabricated. And he, besides saying that he had no family, we also found in the file letters from a guy named John Crosby. And John Crosby was the brother of Henry Clay Hill's wife, basically stating, yes, he had a wife, yes, he had a daughter. And by the time that this document was created, the daughter is now 44, and basically asking whether she could get benefits from her father's pension, or could his widow get her share of his pension. What was never found was an actual divorce from the couple, just basically that he deserted and that was it. So technically she was still married to him, so the widow could still apply for it. So there's letters back and forth between the family in Augusta County, Virginia, through back and forth with the pension office in Washington. So a lot of times, especially with some of the Civil War veterans that we've had over the years that were serving, that they had other families going on. They were in the war and had other families out there that may not know. And now today with DNA, we're able to discover some of these things. The next case was a guy named Elmer Johnson. Elmer Johnson was from Kentucky. He had married a lady named Gladys Councilman in Baltimore, and he had appeared with her in the 1920, 30, and 40 census. Now, of course, the 1950 census is not out yet, won't be out until April next year. However, he basically disappears. And he doesn't, didn't appear in any death records in Maryland, just or anything. There was no divorce, no nothing. and it seemed very odd what actually happened to him. So what we were able to uncover, because this gentleman had some strange information, he filled out we have him in Baltimore with a draft card, and living in Baltimore, and that is with his wife Gladys. And later on, we find a gentleman with the same name dying in Pennsylvania, and finding out through information that this was actually him. He took off, he was a carpenter, takes off and assumes a new family in Pennsylvania and dies there in 1966. So what happens to his wife? His wife still alive. She's still alive, and there was never a divorce. So he basically went up there, started a family, and that was the end of that. So the lie in this is basically marrying someone else and starting a new family, and what actually what really happened with it. Of course, all the parties are now gone. The next thing was a lady named Isabel Campbell. Now, Isabel was a lady, lived in Baltimore. According to her family, she came with her son to New York from Wales, landed at Ellis Island when Albert was 4. That's what was been carried down for the last 120 years. But that's not what happened. Isabel was born in Maryland in 1844. She's actually had two legal husbands and a separate individual. She first appears having a son, Frank, in 1865 with a guy named John Smith, which we've never been able to find a marriage to. And that baptism was at one of the Catholic churches in Baltimore. Then she turned around and marries a Civil War veteran in 1869, has 3 more children. And then after he dies, she goes to collect the widow's pension. And during the pension filing, one of the witnesses was a guy named Albert Dodge. And so then she proceeded to have 2 children by him. And as of, we never find a marriage record, but she still has 2 kids by him. And then in 1890, Albert dies, and his body is almost given a cadaver. So something happens between the time that she has her 2 kids and the time he dies 10 years later in 1890, that the relationship has dwindled, and he's almost considered a cadaver at the Maryland Medical School. And his sister in Syracuse, New York, finds out. And his body is now buried in Syracuse, New York, and not used as a cadaver at the medical school. So the family was under one assumption, and it ended up being something completely different. So here, they were assuming that they had Welsh ancestry, which they may still do. They may have Scottish ancestry, which they still may do with the Campbell name, but it's nowhere near the more recent as they thought. But in the same sense, we also find out that the family knew about the brother Frank, but didn't know about the rest of it. So she dies in Baltimore in 1906, and then under the name Isabel McGuire. So in Baltimore City, and she's actually buried at Loudon Park with 3 of her children from her second husband. So it's one of these things where when in doubt, check everything. If you start to not, if you start to not find things on people, see if possibly another marriage is involved. Let me switch something here. Okay. Well, let me stop a minute.
Maybe if you try display settings.
Hold on a minute. Okay. So that's basically what happened with Isabel. A lot of truth in a lot of these family lores, those sort of things that it isn't always what it's cracked up to be. The next case we had was a guy named Earl Johnson. And what we knew about Earl, according to his family, his name was Earl Joseph Johnson, born December 14th, 1920 in Maine, parents unknown, that he had a brother Eugene, and he died in Baltimore in 1978. And we knew what his social security number was from his death certificate. However, that's all we knew about him. We didn't know anything about his past. We didn't know anything else. But what we were finding out is we were finding articles in the Baltimore paper of a guy that was a criminal whose name was Earl J. Johnson. Similar age. But we really weren't sure that this was him. Now, nothing was known of the family about any of his criminal activity. We also had another document where he was also then known as Elmer Earl Johnson. So we weren't sure whether we were dealing with 2 people, whether we were dealing with 3 people, whether it was him at all. So what eventually happened here was the only document that we could identify of who he was, since he said he was born in Maine prior to his death and sent request to Maine to obtain a birth certificate, no record found. So what we had here on the death certificate was a social security number. what we were able to locate and retrieve was his Social Security application. So that was actually filled out by himself. So what we found out was his name was actually Earl Joseph Johnson. There's his date of birth. He signed it himself. However, when he fills this out, he's at the Maryland Penitentiary, lifelong criminal. And of course, there were the names of his parents, the same parents in the other case I talked about earlier. And none of this was known to the family, to any of his immediate family at all. And the fact that he said he was from Maine, he was actually from Baltimore. So a lot of the misinformation out there, especially people not being truthful, hiding things, covering things up. So, and of course, once we had that information, we were able to obtain his birth certificate. And of course, when you look at his birth certificate, he could have called himself whatever he wanted because there was no name on the birth certificate. So it's one of these things where you want to check everything. When you start finding people that have this type of thing, they could use whatever name they wanted. Probably one of the other cases, I didn't include this other case on here, but when we talk about, when I spoke about Social Security documents, there was a case where an individual had applied for 3 Social Security numbers. Now, back in the day, this could be done. There was no way of stopping it. However, what also happened after the fact was we do know that the individual on the document was the same person applying for 3 numbers from 3 different employers. After that person eventually died, which we still haven't found, there was no claims against those numbers. So one of those numbers was recycled and used by a current living individual. So that process has been stopped. So that was done during a certain period of time, that when an individual's Social Security number was not used, the Social Security Administration recycled it and gave it to a new individual. So you may find records on seeing the number more than once when you're doing research. The next case we had was a guy here that lived here in Harford County during the American Revolution, who was from Connecticut, named Thaddeus Jewell. Now, Thaddeus Jewell was married to an individual here. However, it later came out in the court records that we have that Thaddeus had another family in Connecticut. So these type of information, basically he was a bigamist, and he had a whole different family, was never divorced from the individual or anything, but it came out in some court records that he had this other family sitting in Connecticut. So another case we had with a similar type of issue where we had
we have a question. Where can they obtain Social Security records?
You can obtain Social Security records two ways. One, by filing a Freedom of Information Act request through the federal government, or through the Social Security Administration. And if you already know the number, the person needs to be deceased at least 100 and the person need to be at least 125 years old to have the information unmasked, the names of the parents. However, if the person today would have been under 125 years old, you would need to prove that the parents are deceased. So either the death certificate or some other information that proves that they are deceased. One thing with the Social Security Administration with some of this, it's the one that I showed before. The first time around, they masked the information, and at that time, Mr. Johnson would have been 99 years old. And when the Social Security Administration came back, they said, well, the parents, it's under 125 years, the parents could still be living. And the individual's daughter basically said, if they were still living, they would be the oldest people in the United States right now. So, but it's one of these things where certain regulations have been set with some sets of records. So just be prepared that sometimes questions come along that are a little bit much. So I can submit the link. If you're interested, send your email to Mary or myself, and I'll have my information at the end, and I'll send you the link to order the records from the Social Security Administration. If you have the number, I believe it's like $24. If you don't have the number, it's like 27 or something. And this takes about anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks to receive. And it'll be coming out of the main office in Baltimore. This next case was another marriage that occurred in here in Harford County, and what this was a gentleman named George Christ and Elizabeth Bishop. However, the document on the top right part of the screen is the marriage application which was filed, and then the certificate underneath of it. And what was not talked about or written incorrectly was the fact that Elizabeth Bishop was an African-American lady. So she basically passed off as a white individual, turned around and married Mr. Christ. However, at the same time this marriage was occurring, after that, a article was in the Aegis newspaper in 1891 where she was actually still married to her previous husband. It was another black man, but now she's marrying a white guy. And at that time, that was against the law. So that caused a lot of controversy, especially back then. And we were able to find these documents for the individual that was requesting them. But it's a lot of interesting things that people would write down on original documents that gives you more interesting stories to tell. This next case is probably one of the most interesting cases we've had that I've seen in the 30 plus years doing research. The male that is marrying here, Hannah Calder, to Catherine Beale. Hannah Calder was actually a woman, and she was marrying a Catherine when Catherine was about 18 years old. And they were they had been married by J. Alfonso Frederick, who was a Catholic priest at St. Mary's in Pilesville, Maryland, at St. Mary's Assumption Church. And what was not known by the priest was the fact that at the time that Hannah Calder was actually a woman and not a man. And this wasn't the first time that she had done this. She would disguise herself as a man, and this was actually the second time she actually married another woman. And back then, this was scandalous. The first marriage that she had was with a number, with another woman. Last name was Emma Robinson, who was from the Jarrettsville area. And her father, Calder's father, had the record expunged. And then he married Beale in 1888. That case actually went to court. She filed a habeas corpus case of kidnap. And then the marriage to Beale was eventually dissolved, and then turned around and assumed the name Howard Calder and married that individual later on, I believe 1891, Sarah Kemp, and in Baltimore. And then they left there and went to Florida, and eventually Calder died in 1914 and Kemp died earlier in 1910. And it was one of the things between Maryland and Florida that when Calder died in 1914, they didn't realize that she was a woman. So for the past 100-some years, it's been back and forth from researchers over the years doing articles on Calder, and it's been one of the most probably popular inquiries that we have received in the 30 years of me doing research at the Historical Society. Unfortunately, the Beale marriage, after that was dissolved with Beale turned around and married my great-great-grandfather's brother, and Calder's great-nephew was married to my great-grandmother's sister. So I kind of have a personal connection to some of this. And prior to my grandmother passing away, it was and she actually knew Kate Beale, and it was one of the things that was, when she was younger, it was talked about at the dining room table. And since then, a lot of things have come out about this story, not only the marriage to Beale, but the other marriages as well, that were now, a lot of it was newspaper accounts of different things where we didn't have any physical evidence to actually, for example, these marriage records until recently in the last year or two, where we're able to find actual accounts of these things actually occurring, just different in the paper. What I have on the screen now is the actual record from the St. Mary's Assumption Church in Pilesville, which that in itself, especially in the Catholic Church, is gold, especially at that time. Um, and there was actually a newspaper reporter that came down from New York when this all occurred, during the trial when she was between Beale, and it was firsthand accounts of different family members, and actually they kind of blame Calder for her mother's death in the 1889, because they sent a newspaper reporter down. He's interviewing family members because everybody knew these two when they were young, and it's basically you're building a whole story from original documents, and it's not really this isn't more of a, the lie in this is the fact that she's really a woman and not really a man, but it's building these documents that people for years have been trying to locate, especially in this case. So recently we found these things that people were able to now put something together. So, and this has been published numerous times. Sorry about that, I had something fall on my screen. One of the last ones I have here, I think this may be the last one, is one of the items that we have at the Historical Society is the marriage application books that ran from 1886 to 1930. And over the years, we have found things tucked in among the pages, and this probably was one of the most unusual things that I've ever seen stuck in one of the books. And what we found was, we found a letter from a woman named Sarah Miller from Parkton, Maryland. And what she was doing was writing a letter to her, to the clerk of the court, about her son and her sister. And it was one of these things where you weren't sure whether this was later on became a lie or what really happened with this. And kind of one of those unknown things about after this occurred, what really happened to these two individuals. And apparently they were somewhat, her sister and her son were in somewhat of a relationship and in the tensions of getting married. So the mother was sending a note to the clerk of the court saying, if you see these two people, their intentions are to get married and I'm basically against it. So it's very rarely do you see these type of documents tucked away in different things. And it's kind of like what really happened to these people afterwards. The son eventually married another woman, and the sister ended up marrying somebody else. So it's not really sure what happened with this relationship, but it raises eyebrows of why did it happen in the first place? And this is another case of marriages that you're not sure whether actually it happened or not, and whether things were kept quiet. And this was a case of the girl in the picture on the screen. She basically took off, and her mother, widowed mother, wrote a letter to the clerk of the court, and we have that tucked away in one of those ledgers. That here we actually have a picture of the person, and it's like, what really happened after this? Did she really marry the guy, and where did she marry him? We'll never know. So with that, there's my contact information. Anyone have any questions?